everyone. How's it going? Welcome to Zibby's Bookshop. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We are very excited to help launch Lisa Keefauver's book, which is personally one of my favorite titles, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. She's here with Melissa Gould, who will also be doing a writing class at Zibby's. If you want to check it out on June 24th, sign up on Zibby's website. But we have these two here. They'll be doing about a 30-minute conversation, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A, and we have plenty of books to buy and sell. So take it away.
So thank you. Thank you.
Here we go again.
Here we are. Thank you, everybody, for coming to support my friend Lisa, who wrote this incredible book, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. She also has a podcast, which is amazing, same name. She also did a TED Talk called Grief is a Sneaky Bitch.
No, the TED Talk was called Why Knowing More About Grief Makes It Suck Less.
All right, sorry.
Similar attitude, but you know.
But I was curious if you wanted to share how you came up with this title, which is so memorable and so true.
It is so memorable. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming again. We just did this last night in San Diego for my launch. And thank all of you for coming today. I'm probably going to get teary-eyed. I'm definitely going to swear. I'm probably going to say some things from the heart. And I can't wait to just be in conversation with you later on. But so the name came actually in 2011. At the age of 40, I became a widow after my husband became a very different person. For over the course of a year, we went from doctor to doctor trying to get answers. They told him it was mental health. They put him on meds. They took him off meds. Our lives became really unmanageable. And in the end of July of 2011, we finally, after a year of fighting, got a scan, and it turned out to be a grapefruit-sized brain tumor. And 2.5 weeks after the diagnosis, he died in my arms, and had to go home and tell our 7-year-old daughter that her dad was dead. I was the clinical social worker. I'm getting to the answer, I promise. I was a clinical social worker of a nonprofit in the town that I was living in and working in. And which meant I thought I should know what grief is and what grief looks like and how to do it well. And we'll talk a little bit later about how I recognize very quickly that we are a very grief illiterate culture, and that was a problem. But I found myself about a year after my husband died at a party at a new friend's home who had experienced her own loss, so I felt very safe around her. But I was in a room full of literally all people who didn't know Eric, who didn't really know my story, except like many of you might have experienced when I walked in, I heard people saying, "That's the widow, her husband died," you know, that kind of scenario. And I was actually laughing, which was a weird experience. Again, I think so many people can relate. And I happened to reach in my purse for something, and I never carried around remember back in the day when you had hard copy pictures? Which I never even carried around back then, but for some reason there was a picture in my purse, and I reached in the purse to get something else, saw the picture of Eric, and in the middle of 20 to 30 people I didn't know, I immediately burst into tears. And my friend Autumn kind of quietly, gently ushered me into the other room, and through just heaving, sobbing tears, I said, "Grief is such a sneaky bitch." And she knew, and it stuck, and she knew it immediately. And what I didn't quite realize then, because it took me many years later until I started the podcast and started my work as a grief activist, was there's two meanings. And we didn't talk about this last night, but even though it's a cheeky title and everybody loves it, and usually pretty much universally everybody nods and says, yes, it is, right? We agree. And I think there is something inherently sneaky about grief just by the nature of what grieving is, the emotional, cognitive, physical, spiritual, relational impact that we have. And I personally think that grief has an unnecessarily sneaky component to it. And that's why I do the work that I do as a grief activist. I think we find it sneaky because we've all bought into the story that we just move through the 5 stages of grief like a to-do list, and then we're supposed to arrive at the end and voila, we're better. And so a lot of my work is really making it so much more visible so that it's a lot less sneaky. It's still gonna be sneaky and it's still gonna be a bitch sometimes. And also, if anybody wants to keep track of how many times we say the word bitch this evening, we might have a lottery at the end or some prize.
Maybe an F-bomb here.
Maybe
or
an
there.
F-bomb here or there. It might happen. I don't know what number we got to last night, but
It was high.
it was high.
Lisa, so I know now you consider yourself a grief activist,
Yeah.
but initially doing your social work and clinical work, how was it different once you became a widow? So like your
Yeah.
personal experience with grief versus your professional experience with grief, and when did that intersect?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, I think, of course, I had a master's degree in social work. I had worked in my early career in foster care and adoption, which you can imagine, of course, a lot of grief and loss. I was worked in family services, and at the time I was a therapist working with refugees, people with all kinds of mental health issues. And I was working with, I remember vividly the time I was working with a woman whose daughter had been murdered. I was working with a man whose wife had early onset Alzheimer's. So now we're talking about traumatic death and grief. I was working with this man who had anticipatory grief and ambiguous loss, the kind of losses we experience, right, when someone has a disease. And yet I don't know that I named loss and grief in a lot of my work before then, because that wasn't part of the training, how we saw the work. And so, but it took me about one day back to work, which, by the way, I was called to come back to work 2 weeks after my husband died, and I had to go back, even though I worked for social workers, even though I worked for a nonprofit. That was just the nature of the work. And so it quickly I started becoming a student of what was culturally being said about grief. It started to become visible how problematic it was. I was starting to read, you know, all the different folks who talked academically. And I mean, we have some wise people in this room, including Claire Bidwell Smith just showed up here. Not intimidated at all that she's in the front row. So I really started to see that, but it took me some years to really, so I think I incorporated it immediately into my work, starting naming it for other people and myself. I a few years later moved to Austin, Texas from Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I was living, and founded a cancer nonprofit called the Care Box Program, which is still in business. And though that work, I was the public facing, so fundraising and media, but also program design, I was working very intimately with the families that we were serving. And that's when I think I started to recognize even the need for those families, some of whose children had a poor prognosis, some who had a good prognosis, some whose spouses died while they were in our care. Everybody was so busy talking about getting healthy and cure and fighting and all the language of that. In that role, I even started to be, I would say, like practicing what I now think of as my grief activism, to just pause and name for people, like, even though we're going to fight and we want your son to be better, it's okay to be grieving their lack of health or the uncertainty of their prognosis. But it was very subtle. It took me sort of years later to really decide I can't have had all this. And what I should have said is between those two things, I found myself by my friend Joe, who had been my biggest grief supporter after Eric died, who knew Eric, with him when he died. So that happened 2 or 3 years after Eric died. So it took me a while to sort of recognize I can't have had all this professional experience with loss and this personal experience with loss and be a speaker and an advocate and a writer. I eventually became a professor of loss and grief at the University of Texas. I couldn't not do something with that. And that's when I sort of came up with the title grief activist, because it felt the most resonant to the work that I was doing, and launched from there in 2019. And you will not be surprised to understand that not more than a few people in my life are like, you're going to do what?
Right. Well, people hear,
what's a grief activist, and why would you want to talk about grief, and aren't you going to be sad all the time? And this was 2019, so this was pre-pandemic, before.
It is interesting, like when you work in the grief space, as you do, and several people here, people assume like you sit around crying all the time and that it's so sad and dark and gloomy and depressing. It is all of those things. And life moves forward. The sun shines again. we laugh, we have full lives. Both things can exist.
Yeah.
Like Lisa, I'm also a young widow, and we have had so many conversations where we talk about our husbands and we cry, and then 2 minutes later we're hysterical laughing about. So all of these things can exist at the same time. One of the things, first of all, I love her book so much. And for all of you who are going to read it, you're in for such a treat. I have the privilege of being friends with Lisa. She's so warm. She's so funny. She's so smart. It's all in the book, your whole personality. I love how you're even so gentle in the writing of the book with your invitations to people to take out a workbook, do some work on themselves and their grief, the affirmations that you offer. I would love to invite you to read a little bit from your book.
Yes. All right. Hold on. Let me put my water down and not ruin. Okay. You guys, would somebody mind? Thank you. I was like, let me not ruin the book. I'm going to buy all the books behind me when I ruin them. Thank you very much. Okay. Yes, I would love to read that. And thank you. And I'd love to share a little bit about sort of, for better, for worse, this was my first book, and I didn't know how to write a book that wasn't authentically me, which means the book was very much about holding space. It had a judicious, as the reviewer from Booklist said, a judicious use of cuss words, which I felt was an appropriate summary of the book, and a lot of invitational language of holding space. So I hope you feel like I'm your wise best friend who has some knowledge and is showing up in the work. But I thought I'd read a little bit from this passage about, this is a chapter called Emotions and Feelings and Moods, Oh My, and really trying to help us understand how we get what are okay and not okay emotions, right and wrong, in our collective story of grief, and just the stories we have about what is acceptable and how that can get in our way. So I offer this: you aren't your emotions. Emotions don't have inherent value, and therefore neither do you for feeling them. Emotions can be painful and sometimes unbearable to feel, but they don't represent something good or bad. They're simply information. We develop our grief beliefs around emotions throughout our lives, and many of the ones most deeply entrenched in our way of seeing the world develop in our childhood. We learn the rules of emotions based on the reactions we got from caregivers when we displayed certain emotions. For example, if you were isolated and punished whenever you expressed anger as a toddler, today you likely have a negative story about anger. You might say anger makes me unlovable or not worthy of being around. Or as a teenager, when a parent told you to get over it already only a few days after your first breakup, you might have learned that sadness over losing a partner for any amount of time is unacceptable. Caution: avoid bringing all or nothing thinking to this topic. You also likely learned positive or helpful beliefs from your caregivers. Does this mean you should ignore your feelings because they might be based on unreliable stories or beliefs? Heck, no. I said heck. I didn't actually swear that time. Yes, you need to make space to feel all your feelings. It's necessary, welcome, and informative. And it's important to not take them as facts. It can just be helpful for you to be curious from time to time to discover whether a story has taken hold around certain recurring emotions that you're experiencing, or the absence of certain emotions you've expected to feel. And there are a few things to be on the lookout for. Is the story binary? Does my story include a lot of either or thinking? How long is the duration? Do I allow the stories to go on and repeat them out loud or to myself? The tone: are my stories full of compassionate language or judgmental statements? Ownership: are the stories mine? Do they represent what I believe, or did I inherit them from someone else? And really, helpfulness: do the stories I hear internally when I'm feeling big feelings support my healing, or are they hurting me? One of the things I offer in the book is I talk a lot about where we learn our grief beliefs and what our grief beliefs are. And one of the exercises or skills I offer is around what I call Marie Kondoing your grief beliefs, right? Really evaluating, are they bringing me joy? Are they serving me? And just like I'm trying to do about grief writ large, I'm trying to help us all discover the stories we have about our emotions and our grief, because only when they become visible can we decide whether or not they're useful?
And serving.
And that
us,
comes from my training in narrative therapy and just my belief in the stories we tell and the way we talk about our experiences impact how we live our grief. So that's where we can regain some agency, which is really important, because what we lose when we have a profound loss is a sense of our own agency. Yeah.
And I think a part of that is what you said earlier, which is, we think there are these 5 stages and then we're going to be okay. But because grief is so nonlinear, I feel like you conveyed that in your book.
Yeah.
And the way you structured it, and even your, you could talk about that, just your table of contents, how you can really open the book at any page and find something meaningful. But that was a deliberate thing on your part.
Yes, much to the maybe chagrin of my publishers and editors at UT Press. I created a topic index instead of a table of contents, which seems a slight differentiator, but I really wanted this book. I've had the privilege, well, in my life, but of course, as a host of a podcast, to read, and many authors are in this room right now, some phenomenal books, and they've all offered something really unique. So I wasn't trying to compete with somebody else. I just thought, what is it that I can uniquely offer? And I think as part of my mission, I wanted to really create a book that would be just as useful for somebody who just experienced the death of their mother 3 months ago, to somebody who experienced a stillbirth 20 years ago, to somebody who experienced a non-death loss and was grieving. And I also wanted to reinforce the idea that you're not going to just learn something at the beginning and then check these boxes and you'll get to the end of the book and you can be like,
all better.
Hopefully you do feel somewhat better at the end of the book. And so, I wanted to kind of create themes. And if all this hopping around is making you feel crazy, pick up the book, start at the beginning and read to the end. You're good. You're going to love it. But I wanted people to feel like today I really need some skills, or today I need to understand what's happening to my physical well-being.
Right.
Or I need to know how to communicate with the people in my life who aren't showing up, so that you could just kind of like pop in.
Plus, in those, for me, it was the early days of my grief, but for so many people, it's impossible the idea of, number one, deciding you're going to read a book and then actually finishing it.
Yeah, I did not.
I couldn't. So it's like the little snippets but it's so true. You could pick up your book from page 1 and read the whole thing. And
I also recorded it as an audiobook. So if you don't want to read it and you just want to listen while you walk, you can listen to my voice in the audiobook.
So I also wanted to ask you about Eric, and it's going on 13 years.
That's completely bananas.
I know it's crazy. But how are you different from the early days of losing him when your daughter was 7 years old to where you are now, almost 13 years later? Like, what has changed for you in terms of your own grief story and your grief experience?
Everything. How much time do we have? No. I think it's so different. Almost 13 years. I feel like a completely different person. And I know all of you can feel that way if it's been some time since your loss. My daughter is 20 and finishing her junior year of college. I look like a physically very different person. If you don't know me and you don't follow my story and you saw the picture poster and it was a woman with long blonde hair, that was me a year ago. But 10 days before I turned in my manuscript to the publisher last year, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I spent this last year and a half going through treatment. I'm in remission now. So yay. Anyhow, so that's the reason I actually look different. So sometimes I walk in the mirror and I just think like, would Eric even recognize me? Like how would we be together? As far as my grief, I always say grief doesn't end. Grief just transforms and we're transformed by it. And I would say that's exactly the space that I feel today. I feel Eric very much present in my life. He guides me a lot. I have conversations with him sometimes. It's very bittersweet to be, I'm going to get emotional.
That's okay.
I wouldn't have written this book if Eric was alive, and nobody would be prouder of me and would not be the least bit surprised that I wrote a book than Eric. Last night, my daughter was in the crowd for the book launch, and it was just
amazing.
It was amazing. And she's an amazing young woman. So I think it's metabolized a lot. went through some therapy. I went to a little bit of support group. I, of course, was already us social workers have to do a lot of self-work. That's part of our, so I think in the early years, I thought I had metabolized my grief more than I had.
Right.
And when it took actually having a previous health scare, not this health scare, in 2017, for me to, and some old stuff coming back, for me to really reinvest in attending to my grief. And the thing that I will say is, I think I had done a really good job. Good job. That's a dumb thing to say, but anyhow, I had attended well with kindness and I think some compassion to both the primary loss of Eric's death and the secondary losses that come that we all experience.
I was going to say that even the fact that like this book wouldn't exist without what
so
you've
that's all that
experienced, like
sort of bittersweetness. So I think I had attended to that. I think it took all of that kind of upheaval in around 2018 for me to really actually start to attend to a whole different kind of grief that I hadn't named before. As I alluded to earlier, Eric, I'd like to bring his wisdom into the room. Handsome devil for sure, but didn't know it. Kindest human being, really funny, so attentive. If you were talking to him, he would just lean in like this and you were like the star of the show. And he could do that for everybody in the room. Kind and loyal. He became unrecognizable that year before he died. He did most of the cooking, a lot of the grocery shopping, the chores, the everything. Would carry spiders outside of the house. Like that was him. He became dangerous, physically altered, emotionally altered. I was making safety plans for myself and my daughter, of course, with no answers because people were just saying, oh, it's depression, take a drug. Oh, it's not depression, don't take a drug. And so what I really started to grieve about Eric and about loss was the ambiguous loss. There I lost, my husband was gone. He was standing right in front of me, but he was gone and we didn't have answers. And I really do think making space to process that really helped loosen some of the grip and the weight of grief and to really give myself permission to grieve that loss as well.
it's
And
so
that's how it's
important.
different. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like oftentimes we're grieving and not even aware that we're grieving, especially if you have somebody in your life who's sick and things are so different and you were making, like you said, safety plans and your life just became so different. So of course there's a loss and a process of grief that I don't even think people are aware of until we're so far past it.
Well, and it was like, well, he's still alive and he's still here. You know, but he wasn't. And I was a single parent, even though there was another person in the house.
And I so relate also to talking about secondary losses. And like you're saying, Eric did the cooking.
Yeah.
Eric did the grocery shopping.
I did everything. I lucked out.
Same. My husband, his jurisdiction was our pets and a few of our daughter's hobbies. But in his absence, it was like, oh shit, I have to go to the vet and the dog needs eye drops and things that you don't consider. Like all of those things are losses that you're feeling and you learn somehow to live with.
Yeah.
It's a whole big grief thing.
Yes. Those secondary losses is another dynamic around loss, I think, universally, no matter the primary loss you experience. And I can see people nodding in the room, right? We all experience. The chapter of that book is called Secondary Losses, the Sneakiest Bitches of Them All. Okay, that's 3 if we're counting, maybe 4. We said bitch. Okay.
Yeah.
But I really think they are. And that's, again, part of what I was trying to do in the book is just, I hope that as you read through the book or in whatever order you read through the book, and this is, of course, I was like most writers, I was writing the book I wish I would have had. I'm really trying to normalize all the weird things that you're labeling yourself as having a weird experience, or is this just me, or why is this hard, or, and so I really tried to lay that out in the book, including the physical and cognitive and relational and spiritual impact that we have, which nobody, which is not talked about enough. Just, it's mostly like you're going to feel sad for a while and then you're going to feel less sad, the end.
Right. Well, grief just isn't talked about.
No,
I mean, it's
more and more, but not more and more, thankfully. I think.
Thankfully,
Yeah.
yes, for grief activists. Do you want to talk about grief thieves?
Oh, grief thieves. Actually, we're in a room full of grief thieves right now. Sorry to let you know, even though there's a lot of grievers in this room, most of us are grievers and grief thieves too. So this was this idea that I love a good metaphor. I love a good phrase. I love a good acronym. Don't know where that's always just been a part of my existence. And again, I think comes from my training in narrative therapy. But I started to recognize the ways in which the sayings that we have, you guys know the sayings, they're in a better place now. You're so strong. Someone said to me as I was taking my husband off life support, don't worry, Lisa, he's going to be in a better place soon. I didn't punch him. Can you believe it? I didn't. But the ways in which we all collectively, because we're all part of this culture that really misunderstands and has this limited, narrow understanding of grief, which doesn't just impact the way we show up and say insensitive things to other people, but it also means we deny ourselves the reality and the compassionate experience of our grief. It also has a collective systemic impact. So if we all believe grief is something you just move through quickly and over a year you're done, then your bereavement policies, what you're allowed to grieve changes. Like if it wasn't a spouse, what if it was an uncle or a neighbor? Would you get time off? Does anybody check in on you, right? So all of those things impact the way we can show up for ourselves and others. And so I started to recognize the ways that we grief thief ourselves and other people. Sometimes it's very explicit when someone says to you, at least, you know you've been robbed if somebody starts a sentence with that. And so I really wanted to lay out so that it could be visible again to you as the griever or the grief supporter, if you're reading this book as a grief supporter, the ways that we sometimes accidentally, often without malice, do that. And I talk a lot about in the book that oftentimes the grief thief is the person you're looking at in the mirror. So we know that we're grief thieving ourselves when we hear a lot of shoulds and shouldn'ts. I should be over it by now. I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't cry in front of other people. I should get back to work. And again, just my whole mission is really to make the everyday reality of our grief experiences visible so that we can then have some agency and make some choices about what we want to keep.
And that actually flows in nicely to what I think we both agree, which is bearing witness to other people's grief is so essential to our own healing, their healing. I mean, I just think it's such a big part of the story that I don't always know that non-grievers understand. Bearing witness to somebody's grief.
Holding space and bearing witness was my graduate thesis. So it's been a mission of mine for a couple of decades. Started out around a trauma experience, but then came to be about grief. And I think the thing I'll just add about holding space and bearing witness is our core need as a human being is to belong. Right? I have the privilege of being friends with John Powell of the Othering Belonging Institute. He was on my show, and we talk often in our life about this need to belong. And when we show up to try to fix people or correct them or say things like at least, we're othering them. We're creating distance between us. And so holding space is a way of us first recognizing that our job is not to fix the griever, because grief is not a sign that the person is broken. Right? And so our job is to hold space and bear witness. And that can look like silence and accompaniment, right? One of my best, that same friend whose party I was at would just come over and watch Project Runway with me and not say a thing and let me cry on the couch and just be a physical body next to me because now I was alone, right? Sometimes it's words. And we have Colin Campbell in here. I've got to give him a shout out. He wrote this phenomenal memoir called Finding the Words. Sometimes they are words, but they are words of affirmation. They are words of knowing. They are not words of fixing. They are words of, I see you. And this sucks. And this is hard. And I'm not going to throw in a phrase to try to fix it. I'm just going to be with you where you are. And that's the tone I try to offer throughout the book. I mean, I talk specifically about holding space, but that's sort of the tone I try to show up for the reader.
But you absolutely do. And, you know, we had a similar talk last night, and I just shared that when my husband first died, people would come up to me and say, well-intended, but terrible things, like at least he's in a better place or whatever. But the most meaningful thing that happened for me was I was hiking near my house past a mom I knew from school. And everybody knew me, like Lisa said, when we started, like I was that her husband just died. Like everywhere I went, oh, that's the woman, her husband. So I saw this woman, our eyes met, and I thought, oh, what is she going to say? Like like hiking was my meditation, and we passed each other on the trail, and she just reached out and squeezed me. It was everything. I didn't even know that that's what I wanted. I was bracing myself for the worst, but just her gentle acknowledgement, that was,
Yeah, chef's kiss.
it was.
Yeah.
But Lisa, we mentioned your podcast.
Yeah.
Are there any, because interestingly, the podcast came first, and do you want to share any highlights from the podcast? Because you've had everybody on the podcast. That's how we became friends.
Yeah. The podcast came out of, as I mentioned, I'd already become a speaker, kind of a public speaker and advocate, but also I think I was one of the early listeners to podcasts in general. Like I just have always found that it's a safe space to learn, to experience. And I wanted to create a space where people could listen or learn about grief, where they weren't maybe ready to be in a grief support group or be in a room with people. It was intimate. But I also wanted to model having these honest, real, vulnerable, messy, sometimes I got it wrong conversations about grief. And so, I was a social worker. I literally was like, Google, how do you record a podcast? I've created this sort of thing myself, not knowing where it would go or what kind of impact it would have, not knowing if it would reach anybody, finding out early on that I could never pay to advertise the podcast on Instagram or Facebook because they didn't like the title. And
Has that changed though?
No.
Oh,
we're passing 500,000 downloads probably in the next week, so I don't think it's a problem. We don't need advertising. So it's been, as you're not going to be surprised, it's been therapeutically valuable for me.
Right.
I've learned from every single guest I've had on the show. I've made some phenomenal friendships from the show. It's so hard to pick a highlight. Some of them are sitting in this room, so I'm going to try not to embarrass them. But I think it's just been a space of real learning and healing. It's been an affirmation from listeners around the world, 55 something countries, reaching out to me to just acknowledge. And I've really and I will continue to try to have a depth and breadth of the types of losses, the stories that we're telling. Because my goal by the time I end the podcast, which maybe is another 20 years or so, I hope, I will have told every kind of story or been a space. I'm not telling the story, been a space.
Yeah, you've been a partner.
A partner in telling the stories, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between grief and trauma?
Yeah. Ooh, again, intimidated with Claire in the room. This is what I would say. This is what yes, the trauma queen. This is what I would say about trauma, and you feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I think there is a lot of overlapping symptomatology and emotions and behaviors. In my estimation, all trauma includes grief, but not all grief is traumatic. That's how I think about it. Trauma being inherently a loss of agency, a loss of control, right? Something happened to you that your body couldn't metabolize. And so, as someone who experienced a trauma in my teens, I've spent my whole life working on my hypervigilance, among other things, Grief, I think, is something that we can metabolize. Not always. Some losses are traumatic for sure. But I would say that's sort of how I think about the difference. I would say if you're in this room and you're somebody who's grieving and you feel like you've felt your feelings, you've seen a therapist, you've gone to support group, and you feel like something isn't moving forward, you feel a kind of stuckness, that might be a sign that you want to go talk to somebody who's trauma informed, to just be curious and to help explore some components. I discovered that for myself. And I ended up doing EMDR because there was a particular incidence in Eric's decline that really, I don't want to share the story.
Required it.
It really required it. But that took me a couple of years when I realized, there was a piece of my grief that I wasn't metabolizing.
And it just, again, grief is nonlinear. And here you are so many years later.
Yeah.
I'm 10 years out
Yeah.
myself. And there's still moments where like, oh yeah, there it is. You know,
She is a
sneaky bitch. I think we're wrapping up our part. But I just wanted to end on the importance of being a joy detective, which is something you write about.
Yeah, I do. And sorry, I'm pulling at my dress. This is a new dress, and it's like cutting off the circulation in my stomach because I'm chunkers these days. Yeah, that's really important to me. You know, I think as you started to say at the beginning, and if you're early in your grief and you're like, joy, schmoy, I get not ready for it, then feel free to just skip that chapter or plug your ears right now if I'm going to talk about joy, because it might not be something that's accessible to you in the beginning, and that's okay. I think curiosity, I think wonder, I think joy. We know that awe and wonder has a healing capacity. If you haven't read Dagner Keltner's book on awe, highly recommend it. Just plugging other people's books all night. So one of the practices I started early on was really being a joy detective, much like I do talk about being a should detective in our grief. We neurobiologically have an impulse to look out for danger and what can go wrong. And that's great that our bodies do that. Thank goodness. That's what keeps us safe. But that means we have to bring extra intention and attention to capturing the everyday joys and delights and awe and wonder in our lives. It takes an extra musculature. It's like a muscle we have to use. And that's especially true when we're facing a profound loss. So I talk in the book about the different practices. I've done beauty walks for the last 10 years. That's one way that I do the joy detecting. And I do a little journaling in the day, or I have a couple of friends who I ask to hold each other accountable to share our moments of joy, and they can be big joy or little joy. And so that's been a really important part of.
I think it's so important, even like the small, like getting a parking space.
Yeah. Said like an LA
joy.
person, right?
Yeah. No traffic. Yeah. So it could be anything.
Yeah.
I think it's so important.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're opening up
do folks mind if I stand? I'm going to try not to ruin the microphone, but it might make me breathe a little bit better if I'm not sitting. I was like, why am I losing my breath? Circulation here. Questions, anybody, or comments or corrections?
People get shy.
I know everybody gets shy. Okay. Lisa, takes another Lisa to ask a Lisa question.
What do you think surprised you most? I know you've had many grief experiences at this point.
Yeah.
But as you were writing the book and as you were kind of like really thinking about how you articulate grief, in your experience, what surprised you the most about your grief experiences?
Yeah. Oh, good question. I think it was, which I talk about in the book, I think it was the cognitive impact that nobody had prepared me for. I literally couldn't, I was a voracious reader before Eric died. I could not read a book for almost a year. I threw so many books across my house. If you want to throw my book across your house, you can do that too. It's okay. So I think it was the cognitive impact and how long that lasted, the memory and the processing and the brain fog, the grief brain. And now, of course, thankfully, we have Mary Frances O'Connor who lets us understand why that's happening in the brain. But I think for me, it was sort of the cognitive impact. And then also, I would say Eric was our memory keeper. He had like that killer memory. Those people. Are you one of those people? I was never that person. Forget grief brain. Like we would watch a documentary on Mount Everest, and like 6 months later, he would be like, "Do you remember it was 17,252 feet?" And then that guy was named, and I was like, "I kind of remember we watched a documentary on Mount Everest," But that was so profound because our daughter was 7. So she's asking me all these stories about Eric, and I couldn't turn to him and say, like, did we go to Barcelona? Or what was that place we went on a road trip to? Or what was Lily's first words? Like, that really kind of has been a gut punch. And unfortunately, his family decided to just kind of disappear on us. And so I didn't even really have the stories from his family too. So I think those two things were like, speaking of secondary losses, like I just didn't have my person to be my memory keeper anymore. And that has been a challenge, really, to be honest. My memory is mostly back, although I went through 12 rounds of chemo this last year. So my memory is kind of gone again. I got curls instead. I always joke, this is a morbid joke, but I'm a cancer survivor. I can make this joke about myself. I spent the 80s getting perms because I always wanted curly hair, and I have straight hair, and it took apparently having chemo to get curly hair. 10 out of 10 do not recommend. Definitely get yourself a perm. Anyway, those were the things. Yeah, thank you. Other questions or feedback or comment? Hi, JJ. We're just doing Q&A, JJ. Now, sorry, when you walk in, then I have to announce.
Sorry.
No, you're good. Hi, JJ. Yeah.
So my husband passed away from a glioblastoma. So I'm very familiar with the changing, his personality changing, which I didn't recognize at first.
Yeah.
Which I don't know why they didn't do it MRI.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah. But I'm sure you read multiple grief books at that time. Why did you decide, maybe you said it, I apologize, but why did you decide then, I've got all these grief books like I do that I can't read anymore, or I never read, or just can't, still, it's been 8 years and I still can't read a book.
Yeah.
What made you then decide I'm going to write my own book?
Yeah. Well, a couple of answers to that. In the first 5-6 years, I didn't read a grief book. I mean, in 2011, there weren't a lot of, maybe Joan Didion's book was out by then. I don't remember. And Claire probably had some books, but I didn't know. I wasn't immersed. Like, even though I was a social worker, there was nobody in my community who was like, no one gave me a book. No one suggested a book. Even the one time I went to a grief support group for a little while, they weren't like, books weren't in my kind of periphery, which is why I actually started the podcast first, because that's felt like I can listen. So I did that for a long time. And the book kind of came, the reason to write the book came from reading so many phenomenal writers and experiencing, learning new things myself 8, 9, 10, 11 years later from reading other authors. And then having that collection of knowledge and preparing and teaching the course at University of Texas meant I had to do a lot of reading and prepping. And so I just felt like it was, again, that sort of unique alignment of my professional and personal grief and my particular perspective that I wanted to just offer something into the canon. Is it revolutionary? No, I think it's just a unique voice. It's my voice. And I'm very grateful to receive hundreds, if not thousands, of notes and feedback from listeners over the last 5 years that the way I phrase things or the approach that I have was helpful. And so I thought, I'm going to do it in a book. I did record the audiobook, which was so much fun. And if I were me and I wasn't the writer, I would probably listen to the book and not read it. But sorry, Zibby's Bookshop. Just kidding. Buy a hard copy.
It's easier to gift a hard copy.
Yeah, exactly. Gift a hard copy.
Lisa, who would you say this book is for? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Well, I think it's for everybody. I mean, I really try to write it. There are specific, like the appendices, of course, at the end are specific kind of explanations of things. You can basically like take a picture of it and send it to your grief supporter who is not maybe supporting you the way you want to be supported. But I think again, as I said at the beginning, I tried to write it so that whether you're a new griever or an old griever, that you found something new in there. Definitely could be for folks who experience non-death losses, which was something I really wanted to write, because I think that's a whole category of people who often get overlooked in the sort of grief literature.
Yeah.
Then, new or old. Again, some of it will just be affirmations or like, oh yeah, good reminder. And some of it, I hope, will be new information. So I tried to write it quite broadly, again, just because that was the book I wish I had.
Right.
Yeah. Patricia.
Yeah, I had a question. So after the death of Eric, I'm wondering, how did you navigate balancing your own grief and the grief of your daughter?
Yeah. Not well, probably. I don't know that I did it that well. I took her to a grief support group, and much I think it's our grief house that's here, our house. Thank you. I was living in Michigan at the time, and there was a version of that. So I took her there, and grief support group, and myself. We have very different grieving styles. So I'm a very expressive, intuitive, emotional griever. My daughter is adopted and had already experienced loss and trauma. And her style, even at 7 already, was very internally processing, not showing emotions, felt like a big deal. So I got her into a therapist. I got her into a support group. I did show my emotions around her a lot. In retrospect, I mean, I do think that is valid and important. I don't think we should hide how we feel. In retrospect, knowing what I know now, I maybe would have found more safe containers for my own big emotions and not had them so much in front of her, because I don't think that, given her developmental needs, that was the best thing for her. But no one, I mean, I was a 40-year-old widow. Nobody in my life was telling me how to do this, you know? So that, I think it was a balance. I tried to check in on her needs. I tried to take care of mine. Yeah, I'm not going to say I regret it, but I definitely would do it differently now. If knowing what I know now, I would do it differently. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Other questions, comments?
I do think,
Oh, Claire.
go ahead,
I think a
Claire.
lot about like how grief gets reactivated over
Yeah.
time. And I was just thinking about your cancer diagnosis and how that probably reactivated a lot of grief.
Yeah. Yeah, this has been a big 1.5 years of grief for sure. In part because, like my husband's cancer went misdiagnosed for a year, my cancer went misdiagnosed for a year. I saw 5 different doctors with a lump in my breast who all told me it was a twisted milk duct or it was nothing. And it took took a year to get my breast biopsied. So that in itself was very triggering, because it felt like I literally can't trust anybody. Like, here we go again. And what is the prognosis? And my daughter had just gone through some turbulent times. So now I had to turn around just as she was getting stable and tell her, guess what, Mom has cancer too, you know? And I think the grief was really, interestingly, I had 3 friends going through breast cancer at the exact same time as me, one of which had just been a guest on my podcast. And I'm not comparing, because everybody has their own life, but everybody's like, oh, my husband's going to the store to do this, and my husband's cooking the meals. And I'm like, me, myself, and my rescue dog, who's adorable, but does not go grocery shopping or cook meals. Haven't trained her to do that yet, but maybe someday. And so I felt like my grief, it was like, I have to go through this by myself. Are you kidding me? You know, and so I really leaned into a lot of somatic support and a lot of somatic work, really caring for my body. And I said yes to all offers of help. That was a big difference. That was a big deal. That was like, that took a lot of effort. My manuscript, as I said, was due 10 days after my diagnosis. And the last chapter I had to write between the diagnosis and turning it into UT Press was my chapter on why it's important to let people help you in grief. Okay, universe, cute, right? And so I really said to myself, I'm going to say yes. So I had 3 different friends fly across the country to take turns once a week, not all of them, but taking me to a chemo session, being there when they shaved off all my hair. I had listeners and fans of the show on Instagram offering to knit me caps. And I just said, yes, here's my mailing address, send me a cap. I had just moved to San Diego, so I almost knew nobody. So I had a couple of friends who I'd literally maybe hung out with twice, who took me to chemo appointments because I had very severe reactions. So they had to, in addition to drugging me with the chemo drug and steroids, I had to be on intravenously Benadryl, which, let me just tell you what. You think Benadryl knocks you out with a pill. Well, wait till you get it through the veins. And I just said yes. Anytime somebody said, can I do it? I just said, thank you. Like, I just really practiced grace. And it was awkward as hell. I'm not going to lie. It was really uncomfortable. But I really discovered, which is what I say in the book, not only does letting other people help them because it helps them feel helpful and it helps you because they're helping you. I thought it was going to make me feel more distant, but it made me feel so much closer to those people. And that was a big gift that I didn't think, which was really important because I felt so isolated. I mean, I was swollen. My head was bald. I had sores all over my head. I could barely move. I couldn't taste things. I could barely go walk. I mean, I did walks in my neighborhood and yoga, but the isolation was really severe. And then not having a partner in the middle of the night. So saying yes to all the help was just like, I mean, I'm much closer to all the people who said yeah, who I said yes to. Yeah. Well, that was a bummer way to end. Like,
No, it was, I think it's
Yeah.
important to
Yeah.
talk about. I think that's such a
It's
great
huge.
question, Claire,
Yeah.
because accepting help, it's meaningful to the giver and the receiver.
Yeah.
And it's so essential, just like bearing witness.
Yeah.
And we talked about not every grief is because of a loss per se.
Yeah, it's not 'cause
Going
of
through
death loss.
cancer.
Oh yeah.
That's,
Well, and an identity. I mean,
yeah.
I feel like I'm having a hot flash right now because thanks menopause and chemo for breast cancer. But some of it was the loss of not having a partner to care for me, but also every time I walk by a mirror, I mean, I still look in the mirror and I mean, thankfully my hair is growing back and it's kind of cute, but you know, I still don't recognize, and I'm missing half my body over here. It's like, I still don't recognize myself. And that is a grief that I'm still processing it right now. This is very fresh. I literally just got my port removed like 3 weeks ago. So this is very fresh.
Next book.
I was just.
Get to work.
Can I
That's
just
right.
tour this book first? please?
Yeah. All right. Well, I think
That's
our
it, unless
time
other
is
folks
up.
have questions.
Yeah, let's-
Thank you all so much for coming, and for those of you who bought the book, for buying it or gifting it to a friend. It just means so much to me. Am I going to sign books or what's the? Okay.
Yeah, we have plenty of books up here.
Yes. Ugh, did I need to have a hot flash right in the middle of that?
I know, Lisa, you're adorable.
This is like, I'm like having a hard time breathing.
Should we hold
Oh,
up your
should we
book?
hold it